I don't know if you guys saw, but Russian jets entered NATO airspace. Specifically, the airspace of NATO member state Estonia, one of the Baltic countries that is on the border with Russia and is one of the nation states that are most fearful of what happens post-Ukraine due to Russia's historical conquests of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the lead up to World War II, and due to the recent statements from the Russian government, from Vladimir Putin himself. When he invaded the country, he clearly laid out that the post-Soviet sphere is the Russian sphere, and that these countries, the framework that he put forward for why he could invade and conquer Ukraine, could easily be equally applied to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and a whole other host of countries that have either been historically occupied by the Russian Empire or have been conquered by the Soviet Union, or both, as is the case with Ukraine. So these territorial claims have not been completely let go of. These claims on either not necessarily the territory, but at least the national sovereignty of these states. As Putin said for the invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine either exists as part of Russia or not at all. So these nation states are quite nervous about what comes after the invasion of Ukraine. There are actually some Baltic states that are already building trenches on the border, preparing for that outcome. And now we are seeing in the follow-up, after we saw Russian drones enter Polish airspace, 19 drones in a single night entering Polish airspace through both Ukraine and Belarusian airspace, and then drones entering Romanian airspace before turning around and then striking Ukraine, meaning they're using NATO airspace to attack Ukraine. They're not just using Russian airspace to attack Ukraine. They're not just using the airspace of supposedly neutral countries like Belarus to attack Ukraine. They are also using NATO states like Romania and their airspace to attack Ukraine. Now, the Romanians actually this year passed a law giving them the authority to shoot down these drones. Now, it might seem ridiculous on its face for a country to have to pass a law to say that they could shoot down a drone that's hostile and in their airspace, but that is what happened. It got an overwhelming majority. Not every vote in the parliament, though, to give you an, so apparently not everyone agreed that they should shoot down Russian drones in Romanian airspace, but the majority did, though they didn't use that power. In the instance of Poland, there were multiple drones that were shot down by very expensive NATO missiles. We're talking about $10,000 drones being taken out by $2.8 million NATO missiles that were intercepted by F-16 and F-35 aircraft. Now, if we move over into the Romania example, it was actually quite different. Though they had both, of course, the national sovereignty to defend itself and have explicitly passed laws giving them the power to do this, the Romanian pilots did not shoot down the Russian drone in their airspace. They actually, to be quite blunt, escorted the drone through Romanian airspace before it came back around and then attacked Ukraine from behind. So there's a huge list of issues with either of these, the drone attack on Poland or the access of Romanian airspace that the Russians did. Number one, if you can use NATO airspace to attack Ukraine, then they will utilize NATO airspace to attack Ukraine. And not only can this cause accidents where, let's say, a drone falls and hits a house in a NATO country, which could cause an international incident that might cause conflict between two powerful alliance structures. And there is, of course, not only the threat of an accident occurring, but there's, of course, the open goal of using NATO airspace to attack Ukraine. If our goal is to pressure the Russians to stop the war, if our goal is to support Ukraine to help them pressure the Russians to stop the war, if our goal is to help try to protect Europe and nation-state sovereignty and stand up to our credibility and, make sure that this nation-state that gave up its atomic arsenal is not punished for that decision to trust us, if that's what we're going to do, then we should not allow our airspace to facilitate attacks on Ukraine. So there's the use of their airspace to attack Ukraine. Then there's the other problem, 19 drones in Polish airspace, the biggest air attack on Poland since the Second World War, as was stated by Polish officials. I'm not just saying that because that's my framing. That's the framing of the Polish government. They summoned Article 4. Not Article 5, which is, they would call these nation states to the defense to go to war in protection of Poland, but Article 4, to call a meeting between NATO states to talk about next steps in defense of the country. There's also been a lot of speculation about the purposefulness of these attacks, because there is, and I know we have an article here that talks a little about this. Intel officials are split on whether Russia deliberately flew drones into Poland, but agree Putin is getting more aggressive. So there's a question as to which houses like this damaged by Russian drones, whether this was done purposefully to test NATO airspace, or whether this was done on accident. And that now that we have these gigantic air attacks on Ukraine of over 800 drones in a night, and I said this before, I'm going to say it again, 1,000 drones by the end of the year. There will be a 1,000 drone attack from the Russians before the end of this year. I would not be surprised if we had it well before Christmas. That's just where the trend is going. That's just where Russian production numbers are going. And so don't expect these air attacks to turn down. Expect them to turn up. Expect them to expand. Expect them to escalate. And expect them to continue to escalate going into 2026. So with this ever-expanding drone attack, with these ever-expanding air attacks, the idea of a few of these drones going too far isn't impossible to believe. What made it hard to believe is that it was 19. That's quite a lot of drones to say oopsie. If I'm like, I dropped a sandwich on the floor, I'm very sorry. I dropped a second sandwich on the floor, I'm very sorry. I dropped at a certain point, you have to stand there saying, I don't know about that. I don't know if that's an accident. And one thing that made it suspicious was it's traveling through Belarusian airspace, not Ukrainian airspace, for some of these drones. And again, just the sheer quantity of these drones. And of course, the possible intended side effects. Whether it was purposeful or not, these drones getting shot down by $2.8 million NATO missiles when they're worth just a couple of $10 to $20, $30,000. $30,000 being the high end, by the way. The defense economics works out for the Russians. It's a very cheap way to test NATO air defense systems. It's a very cheap way to test NATO response times, to see how quick, in the case of Estonia, Italian F-35 fighter jets are going to scramble. You want to know how long? It took 12 minutes. For 12 minutes, they were in NATO airspace. So there is a certain test that's going on here, a certain probing that I think is meant to see how fast NATO can respond, what they'll respond with, as well as testing their air defense systems. In fact, it makes me question whether or not the decision-making to shoot these things down are not just motivated as what they said in Romania. They said, we didn't shoot it down because we were scared it could hurt some civilians. Mind you, they said it was largely over desolated areas, so it didn't really match up to what the Romanian government was saying. But there is a question of maybe they're not engaging because they don't want to test their air defense systems on these things. They don't want to show them where their air defense systems are. I have no clue. But either way, the signal that's being sent right now, with a lack of overwhelming response to this, whether it was purposeful or not, either way, the Russians test out NATO airspace. Either way, they test out the air defense systems. Either way, they test out response times. It doesn't really matter if it was purposeful or not when it comes to the end result of testing NATO. It does matter when trying to determine a response to some degree. But either way, let's say best case scenario for the Russians, if we're taking the Russians to not be interested in doing this, they're not interested in the escalation, they're not interested in taking this in that direction. If they end up sending the drones that end up probing NATO airspace anyway, they still get the data. They still get the response. They still get the gauge what NATO will do. If you accidentally throw drones into a country, you're still going to get a response, and you're going to get information from that response. And if Europe does something, say, responds by throwing their own drones in the Russian airspace, responds by deploying more troops on the border, responds by sending Ukraine more aid, which is probably the most effective way to get real physical pressure on the Russian armed forces, which are actually doing these violations in the first place. But you got to find some response. Now, if you give no response, if you do nothing because you're scared of escalating, if you do nothing because you're scared that shooting down one drone might lead to another drone, if you don't do anything because you don't want to upset the Russians in some manner, what you could end up doing is just egging them on. You could just end up egging them on. If they think that the United States, probably being the one I need to call out most succinctly, and their allies are not going to respond in kind to the Russians, if they determine that it's being done purposefully or not, then what motivation does Moscow have and those making the decisions behind the walls of the Kremlin? What motivation do they have to stop? What motivation do they have? I mean, it's $10,000 a pop in response to a $2.8 million missile. The economics make sense. Testing the airspace makes sense. Testing the diplomatic will of Europe, now that you've gotten the United States to back off in large part, not entirely, but in large part, it makes sense. All of these make sense to both gauging the diplomatic reactions of the European continent and trying to test their air defense systems, as well as showing a certain amount of resolve, showing that the Russians are willing to go further than maybe some European states would be willing to go, vice versa. That might not be the case for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, etc. But these are the states that would first be received, first attacked, if the Russians did go to war with NATO. If they crossed the Suwalki Gap, if they went and took the offensive operations that most military planners assume they would, these are the countries that they would be attacking into. They'd be attacking into Poland. They'd be attacking into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Lithuania first. And these were the countries that, therefore, are most fearful. And so when there's no response from the White House, I mean, less than no response. When Donald Trump was asked about this by the press, and this was during the last major air attack, this was 19 drones entering Polish airspace. He said, well, maybe it's a mistake. And that was it. That was it. He didn't say if it's not a mistake, then we're going to do X, Y, and Z. He didn't say that if that happens again, there'll be consequences. He didn't say the Russians have to be more careful or there might eventually be consequences. He just said, whoopsie, oopsie, whoops, how'd that drone get in there? You know? Oh, I thought the weather report said it was going to be hailing today. Guess it was drones. This is just going to encourage the behavior. That's what it's going to do until Donald Trump and NATO as a whole, but especially the American government, puts forward that there will be consequences, then nothing will happen. And the sad thing is, and when I say nothing will happen, I mean no progress will be made on stopping these types of attacks. There will be things that happen. It will just be things that endanger people's lives and endanger this war of spiraling out of control, of meeting some point of no return where the White House might have no option but to take a physical, direct response in defense of a NATO country that has called upon Article 5. You need to stop it before it gets there. Mind you, the way that Trump talks about Ukraine is that there's no interest to us there. Is that we're separated by an ocean and there's no interest to us. Originally, it was, I need to get elected because World War III is going to happen. Then he gets elected. Never mind, World War III doesn't matter as much anymore. We got that under control. But while they're saying they got that under control, we got drones, the largest air attack on Poland since the Second World War. We got Russian jets entering Estonian airspace. We got Russian drones using Romanian airspace to attack Ukraine while, again, violating NATO airspace. We got jets scrambling to fire multi-million-dollar missiles to knock these things out of the sky, and we have no reason to believe that this is going to stop in the immediate future. In fact, we have many reasons to believe, based upon the motivations that the Kremlin has, that they're going to expand this. I would not be surprised if 19 is not the largest number we see. Maybe they'll choose to do 1 here, 2 there, 3 there. Maybe they try to be more subtle in order to avoid a type of over-the-top American response, or really any American response. But the risk is there, and the motivation is there. And so until Donald Trump creates a disincentive, either by saying they do this, we'll do X, or something, then it's only going to get worse. And the worst part is Trump might have already taken words off the table. That really is the worst part. The great negotiator, the art of the deal, the man who's supposed to come in and the war in the Congo and the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan and the war in Ukraine and this war and that war and the war in Gaza. The man is supposed to end all of these wars, create all these accomplishments, be able to go out there and show himself to be a diplomatic maestro. And we got no pressure and response, no diplomatic, I mean, not even a call out. And we've got the war expanding into NATO states. Again, we're scared of World War III. We have to stop that. Now we have the largest air attack on Poland since the Second World War, and it's no longer our concern. It was just a campaign trick. The concerns about World War III were just a campaign trick. The concerns about the expansion of the war was just a campaign trick. The war has expanded in every way since Donald Trump has invaded. Is it expanded on the ground front when it comes to the offensives that the Russians are doing? It is expanded on the air front when it comes to the size of the air attacks. It's expanded when it comes to the amount of territory that's being attacked with those air attacks, as we're seeing it go into Romania, Estonia, Poland, as well as deeper and deeper into Western Ukraine as they increase the size of these air attacks. The amount of civilians that died last month is the largest amount of civilian casualties since the very start of the full-scale invasion. The war has expanded in just about every discernible way since Donald Trump has taken office. And now we have NATO states that we, by treaty, have to come to their defense if they are attacked. By treaty, we have to come and defend them. We're allowing that to happen while calling it a mistake. This is how you overplay your hand and stumble yourself into a war. By saying, oh, come on, it doesn't matter all that much. You know, maybe it's a mistake, maybe it isn't. And then one day, one of these drones doesn't just hit a farmhouse that didn't have anybody in them. Maybe it'll be some civilians that get hurt or killed, or maybe it'll end up hitting a Polish governmental building. Or maybe the Russians, more emboldened than ever, especially if we give no response, think that they could just I mean, the way that these drones work is they pre-program the coordinates. So if they pre-program the coordinate of these factories that the Poles are trying to make so they can get to 130 to 150,000 shells every year in the next few years, what if they throw a few drones and it ends up hitting those factories and they just call it an accident? Will Trump accept that on face value? Will he accept that the Russians bombing that factory was an accident? Will he accept that 19 drones was an accident? Will he accept that the drone into Romania was an accident? Will he accept that the Russian jets, the jets that drop missiles, by the way, that those jets entering Estonian airspace was an accident? Look, this is Trump's easiest job. This is Trump's easiest job. All he has to do is say, don't bomb Poland. How hard is that? How hard is that? Is that very difficult?
Burns is an immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Thank you very much for the tier 1 sub. Means up for 14 months. Finished The Road to Unfreedom by Timothy Snyder. What a wonderful book. He wrote a lot of wonderful books. That is also one of them. If the jets were armed, they could have launched missiles today with maybe 20 to 30 second warnings before impact. Again, one mistake, one bomb dropped in the wrong location. You have some sort of Yugoslavia Chinese embassy bombing moment. We already had the British consulate in Kiev get bombed. We had the EU diplomatic building get bombed. We've had American corporation buildings like the offices for Boeing. They got bombed. Mind you, again, it was Trump who said that these type of businesses would stop the bombing. He said that these types of investments in private American business would disincentivize and deter the Russians from engaging in this type of behavior because they wouldn't want to anger the United States. Now they're bombing, throwing these drones at, attacking, whatever way you want to throw it. Because I saw some people taking a problem with the word bomb in reference to these drones crashing into Poland. They're throwing air attacks at Poland. Poland is a NATO country. We are treaty bound to protect them. The whole incentive was to stop the war before it got to these countries that would directly drag us in. Trump is learning. Well, actually, the problem is he isn't learning, But many of us are learning in real time what happens when you say, no, not only you can push up through, through Ukraine, you can push up through these states that are on the borders of NATO, you can push up into NATO. The more you give, the more they're going to take. The Russians will keep pushing until they meet a wall of brick and stone and iron, until they run into something that does not budge, either a Ukrainian front line that does not budge or some American and European diplomatic sturdiness. They're just going to keep going forward, man. It ain't stopping. And somebody needs to slap Trump awake and get him to do the job of stopping a spiral that could quickly go out of control. I mean, if this happened under Biden, you know what we would be hearing, right? Sleepy Joe let Poland get bombed. Sleepy Joe is not. Sleepy Joe said he was going to stop the war. The wars are expanding. This is how he would talk about it. How come NATO hasn't even made a statement yet, Dylan? They did make a statement. You want to see NATO's statement in reference to this? If you guys are curious. Earlier today, Russian jets violated Estonian airspace. NATO responded immediately and intercepted a Russian aircraft. This is yet another example of reckless Russian behavior and NATO's ability to respond. They scrambled jets. That's their ability to respond. That is what they're referencing. Mind you, we can give a hard response.
A curd is a curd.
Trump believed that this was a proxy war, and Ukrainians were only fighting because Biden told them to, and if he told them to surrender, they would.
Then he did. Then it didn't happen. All the people who said that Ukraine was a proxy on the left and right ended up being dead wrong. Seemed like the Ukrainians aligned themselves with powers that they thought could get them to their own ends because they're an independent state trying to survive as they're aggressed upon by the largest country in the world. And now they've made a mess of it. This is from 2015. The Turks shot down a Russian jet when they violated NATO airspace back in 2015. At a certain point, if the Russians don't stop, what option do they have? And if Trump's really the, shoe from the hip cowboy, he needs to make that red line clear, not just with language, because Trump says a lot and then doesn't deliver on many red lines in reference to the Russians, but with actions, i.e. moving more jets to the region. This is from the Polish foreign minister. Last week, Poland. Today, Estonia. Russia is once again provoking and showing that it is not interested in peace. Poland declares solidarity with Estonia and strongly condemns the violation of its airspace by Russia.